Welcome to the Colorado Department of Education webinar, Gifted Identification Assessment Practices and the Multiple Pathways to Identification. The intent of this webinar is to create a common understanding of gifted identification as it pertains to Colorado statute defined in the Exceptional Children Education Act, otherwise known as ECEA. The goal of the webinar is a facilitation of professional learning. Therefore, the webinar is intended to be led by the administrative unit, otherwise known as AU, Gifted Coordinator or Director, who will facilitate the discussions throughout this presentation. If it is not possible for the webinar to be facilitated by the AU Coordinator or Director, and you are individually viewing this webinar, then it is strongly encouraged upon the completion of the webinar, you review your identification determinations and any questions you may have with your AU Gifted Education Lead, to ensure there is consistency in identification practices by educators throughout Colorado. Before you proceed with the webinar, it is also important to download the accompanying documents necessary for this presentation. You may wish to print them or be able to access them on your computer. Here is a complete list of the documents you will need and the order in which they will be reviewed during this webinar. To complete the webinar will take approximately 3.5 to 4 hours. This includes time where you will pause the webinar and conduct team discussions. Part 1 will take approximately 1 to 1.5 hours and will review gifted terminology as it pertains to identification. Part 2 will require about half an hour to review the areas of gifted identification. Part 3 may be subdivided into 4 parts. There will be 4 student identification scenarios, and each scenario will take approximately a half an hour. The content of the webinar will include a review of Colorado guidelines for gifted identification. A comprehensive examination of these guidelines can be found in the identification chapter that you are encouraged to download and review upon the conclusion of this webinar. Additionally, the presentation will identify areas that are the choice of the AU in terms of identification decisions that support the demographics and culture of the administrative unit. Anytime you see a large blue C, this indicates an area where the AU has a choice in identification assessment practices. Our former identification practices were first established in 2007 with the passing of House Bill 7-1244. The creation of gifted education rules outlined in the Exceptional Children Education Act followed this legislation. The passing of House Bill 141102 required a revision to the original ECEA rules. The rule revision has created an opportunity for Colorado to review current identification practices to ensure they align to statute. What has been added with rule revision include the following elements, which will be discussed in greater detail throughout this presentation. But briefly, these include seeking identification referrals from a variety of sources, a timeline of 30 days after receiving that referral for the team to make a decision on next steps, and that to be communicated to all stakeholders, including the parent, student, and educators. That AUs have assessments to ensure the identification of traditionally underrepresented population, and that identification is a review team procedure. A determination letter upon the conclusion of the identification process should be sent to the parents and placed in the student's cumulative record folder. Not meeting criteria on one assessment shall not limit identification. ECEA rules state the guidelines for identifying students for a talent pool and the idea of portability in gifted identification. Again, the purpose of this webinar is for us to explore the various pathways that might lead to gifted identification. We will review important information to help us build a bridge of common understanding throughout the state so that from one end of Colorado to the other end of Colorado, gifted identification follows a set of standard guidelines aligned to gifted education rules. However, at the same time, providing a level of autonomy to AUs and districts in creating an identification framework that best meets the needs of their unique students. The outcomes of this webinar include building a common understanding of the gifted identification process, to understand that there will be multiple pathways that might lead to identification. You will practice using identification guidelines and complete several student scenarios, and then have the ability to collaborate with team members to initiate your next steps in your identification practices. As we proceed through this presentation, it is important that we stay focused on the needs of our gifted students in Colorado. This means we may need to expand our thinking in perhaps some different ways than we have before when it comes to gifted identification. As stated, this presentation examines the different pathways that lead to gifted identification. As a state, we will come together to ensure there is a common understanding of the intent of the law, to ensure students from underrepresented populations are not denied equal access, and that the needs of students pave the path to appropriate and equitable identification procedures in all our AUs and districts. This photograph is possibly symbolic of our work. The pathway to identification may be paved in different colors of pencil, for example. This is similar to how a variety of instruments are used during the identification process. And that pathway may not always be straight for some students. It may be bent or have numerous contours. You see, each student will have their own unique pathway to identification. But at the end, there will come a point when identification practices must be consistent in Colorado to ensure a student's identification is honored in any school district throughout our state. Again, it will be the choice of the administrative unit to determine these assessment practices. A question many of us are asked as gifted educators is, why do we identify? The textbook response to this question is, identification ensures that appropriate programming meets the academic and affective needs and post-secondary outcomes of identified gifted students. However, beyond the textbook response, if we examine what we know to be true in our hearts and minds as educators, we know that by not identifying students with exceptional abilities, the outcome may very well be a student who is unable to pursue their passions, work to their potential, fulfill their dreams, or recognize their remarkable promise. We will begin by reviewing some important terminology as it pertains to our gifted education rules and identification. Gifted education rules ensure that if a student moves from one district in Colorado to another district in the state, the student retains his or her gifted identification. This is a concept referred to as portability. The idea of portability is new, and it was introduced with the passing of House Bill 1102. Portability, then, means a student's identification in one or more categories of giftedness transfers to any district in our state. Gifted programming then must continue according to the receiving district's programming options they have available. As stated before, portability of identification must be a part of the student's permanent record and recorded in the advanced learning plan. One important note: what happens if a Colorado district does not follow the criteria as stated in guidelines? Well, then the receiving district, if they find the body of evidence to be incomplete, that receiving district must consult with, as practical, that former district, the parents, and even possibly the student, and then move forward and reevaluate the identification determination. Portability does not include students who move to Colorado from another state. Portability is about students within Colorado. However, if you are a region heavily impacted by military students moving into your district, it is important that you review the process and procedures for gifted military students in terms of the Military Compact Agreement. Information about this agreement can be found at the Military Child Education Coalition website. When we hear the word assessment, we often think of a test. But assessment, in terms of gifted identification, is the process of gathering information using appropriate tests, instruments, and techniques. The information then is gathered for a specific purpose, such as for a screening or a classification or selection. for curriculum planning or diagnosis, program planning, and progress evaluation. Districts have a choice in the tests, instruments, and techniques used in the gifted identification process. Gifted identification must also contain a body of evidence. A body of evidence contains data to identify the area of giftedness defined in the definition of gifted children, and then determines that individualized programming services to meet those unique learning needs. Now, the body of evidence will also guide us in the development of the advanced learning plan. Again, it is the choice of the administrative unit to determine what elements go into building a body of evidence. A body of evidence is comprised of both quantitative data and qualitative data. An example of quantitative data might include a normed reference test, such as a cognitive assessment or an achievement test. It may also include criterion reference tests, such as our state assessment or curriculum-based measures that you have in your district. Qualitative data might include a completion of a rubric to observe a student in conducting a certain performance, to complete a checklist, or perhaps interview an educator or even the student. Again, it is the choice of the administrative unit to determine the types of quantitative and qualitative data that will be used to make up the body of evidence. Now, here is an example of the different types of information that can develop a body of evidence. Now, these might include things such as a cognitive test, achievement tests, a norm reference observation scale, performance evaluation, a creativity test, and then parental input, and then additional data, such as those classroom diagnostic tests, an interview, or perhaps that checklist. Now, specific data within the body of evidence will be used to qualify the student for gifted identification. However, other parts of the body of evidence will help build the student's learning profile. Criteria then are those rules for evaluating a level of exceptionality that we will use for the identification assessment process. The 95th percentile ranking and above describe the rule for exceptionality when using a normed reference standardized test, for example. Now, other tests have performance levels. Sometimes performance levels are distinguished, advanced, or demonstrate that the student is exceeding expectations. Such performance levels may be found on certain qualitative tools that you use, the use of evaluating a portfolio or a performance, or perhaps in our criterion reference state assessments. Now, it is important to note that criteria are not cut-off scores. A cut score is often referred to as a gatekeeper. And we know that one score should never keep a student out of a possible gifted determination if all the other data over time support exceptionality. We'll spend some more time on this concept later in the webinar. So a body of evidence will contain data that are used to qualify the student. Again, those might be normed reference or criterion reference tests, a norm reference observation scale, or a performance evaluation. And there will be this additional data that goes into the body of evidence. That might include anecdotal records that the teacher keeps, again, a student interview, an informal observation of the student, or a checklist. But this body of evidence will then lead to developing the student's learning profile. And that learning profile will then become instrumental in developing the student's advanced learning plan, otherwise known as an ALP. Now, tests that provide quantitative data can be divided into normed reference assessments or criterion reference assessments. Let's review the difference between these two in terms of its purpose, its content, and its interpretation of data. So the purpose of a normed reference test is typically to classify students, to highlight their achievement differences. We typically rank order students, and their scores are compared to this larger group called the norming group. Now, test content is selected based on how well it discriminates those achievement levels among students. The data that we receive from these type of tests will help us determine a student's performance based on that larger group or that norming group of similar students. Students receive a percentile ranking score on a normed reference test. But that percentile ranking score often doesn't tell us, the educator, really what the student actually knows or is able to do. Now, an example of a percentile ranking that we're probably very familiar with is the standard ranking of a person's height based on your age and your gender. Now, if you're at the 85th percentile ranking, that means 84% of the typical population is shorter than you and 15% of the typical population is taller than you. A percentile ranking compares you to a normative sample. That normative sample is of similar gender and age. Now, the purpose of a criterion reference test then is to determine how a student compares to other students and to see how well a student has learned the knowledge and skills which they were expected to master. Therefore, test content is selected on the basis of what were the original learning outcomes? What did we deem most important for this student to learn? And we will select that content based on the significance of our curriculum or possibly our state standards. Therefore, the data that we receive gives us information on how well that student performed on the educational goals that were established, or those learning outcomes, or the state standards. And we receive either a percentage or a performance level on a criterion reference test. So let's look at the type of data we receive on a criterion reference test. Often we receive a percent correct or a designated performance level. Now, a student earning a 97% on, let's say, an end of semester math test means that the student answered 97% of the math questions correctly. Now, our state assessment, that is an example of using a performance level to measure how well students answered questions aligned to their grade level state standards. To earn a specific performance level, a student must be able to answer a specific number of test items correctly to earn their designated proficiency level. Before we move forward, there is a word of caution in using percentages for gifted identification from criterion referenced assessments. Let's take the example of a student that we think about identifying gifted in the area of mathematics. If a student gifted in mathematics scores a 95% on a grade level standards-based test, we would most likely use this data to build her body of evidence or her learning profile. But let's assume that this student is in an above grade level math class. We could then use that data for qualifying evidence for gifted identification. Now, Susan Asseline states a student scoring at the 85% or above on an above grade level assessment is a score that we can consider to be in the advanced or exceptional range for gifted identification. When considering state assessment data to make gifted determinations, the performance level of advanced was previously used with our TCAP assessment. With our new state assessments, the performance level of distinguished or exceeds expectations will be used as qualifying evidence for identification. Districts assess student achievement using a variety of instruments. These might include the use of a standardized achievement test, which is designed to measure the knowledge and skills a student has learned in school. Now, here are an example of commonly used achievement tests in Colorado. These assessments may be used for qualifying data to identify a student if the student scores at the 95th percentile or above. Now, districts also administer different diagnostic or inventory assessments typically used to measure attainment of foundational learning skills. An example of diagnostic inventories are those used as part of our READ Act. Now, diagnostic inventories are not used as qualifying data, as they are intended to measure grade level, foundational skills, and do not measure exceptionality. Now, we also have curriculum-based measures, which may include a common assessment a district creates or an end-of-the-course test, for example. Now, these may be used as qualifying evidence if they are off-level tests, as described previously. Now, a body of evidence often contains a cognitive test. Cognitive tests are designed to measure a student's general intellectual ability. Now, such tests do not measure specific academic aptitude in our various content areas such as reading or math. Now, we have two types of cognitive assessments widely used in Colorado, which include the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, also referred to as the NNAT, and the Cognitive Abilities Test, referred to as the COGAT. Some districts have chosen to administer the Cognitive Abilities Test. Now, the COGAT is divided into 3 separate batteries, or sections of a test. These sections, or batteries, are identified as a verbal battery, a quantitative battery, and a nonverbal battery. Now, it's important to note that the batteries are just composed of different types of questions because all the questions within COGAT and within every battery measure the same thing, and that's general or fluid reasoning ability. Now, it is important to state that batteries are not used to identify a category of giftedness. So, for example, we don't identify students gifted in verbal or quantitative or even nonverbal. Also, Dr. Lohman, the creator of the COGAT, has stated that the composite score should not be used for identification purposes. So, for an example, an exceptional score in the verbal area does not always equate to a student who we're going to identify gifted in reading. Now, we do know there is a high correlation between the two. Likewise, a student who scores high in the quantitative battery doesn't necessarily mean that that student is going to be identified in the area of mathematics. Some districts have chosen to administer the COGAT screener as an instrument for their universal screening process. Now, the COGAT screener is shorter, it takes about 30 minutes, and it may be used to select a group of students who then move on to additional assessment. The data that we receive from the COGAT screener may not be used as the criterion for identification, in other words, qualifying data. For those students who score at a certain level on the COGAT screener, the district would then want to move forward and administer a COGAT full battery to obtain the necessary information for possible gifted determination. Some districts also are administering the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test. This is a test of only nonverbal type questions and requires no spoken or written language to be able to answer these questions. But this type of assessment is still providing us that general ability score. Now, it is important to note that nonverbal does not indicate a type of giftedness, but rather describes the type of questions on a cognitive assessment. These questions measure general intellectual ability, or remember that fluid reasoning, by using pictures or images. In this example, the student doesn't have to read any text or compute with any numbers in order to provide a response to this question. Nonverbal is not a category of gifted identification in Colorado. Now, an exceptional score on a nonverbal battery does not necessarily mean a student is a visual spatial learner. The nonverbal test questions do not measure spatial ability because questions are not represented in 3 dimensions. Students are not required to create a mental model or solve a problem with what's called a hidden fold. Now, other assessments would be required to determine if that student has exceptional visual spatial abilities. Visual spatial is really a learning style and is not an area of gifted identification in Colorado. Qualifying data can also be much more than a test score. Performance evaluation is an important component of a body of evidence. Examples of a performance evaluation may include a juried performance, national or statewide contests or competitions, the creation of a student portfolio, or classroom performance. The use of a normed reference observation scale is important to add to your identification toolbox. Now, these normed reference observation scales are used as qualifying data for gifted identification. These scales are a very valid and reliable way for educators and even parents to evaluate gifted behavior characteristics. We have 3 that are most commonly used in Colorado, and those are all 3 normed and provide us very valid and reliable results. Those are the scales for identifying gifted students, otherwise known as the SIGs, and the SIGs also has a parent form that can be completed as well. There is also the Gifted Evaluation Scale, known as the GES, and the Gifted Rating Scales, or GRS. Now, there is also a word of caution about using other qualitative observation scales. Now, there are other observation scales that are not normed reference, but we have seen very successful use of these scales in recognizing students with potential from underrepresented populations. 2 such scales that we often see used in Colorado are the Kingor Observation Inventory, otherwise known as KOI, and the Teacher's Observation of Potential in Students, otherwise known as TOPS, which is part of the U-STARS program. Now, important to note that data collected from KOI or TOPS provides information to build the student profile and perhaps move the student forward in the assessment practice, but we do not use that data as qualifying data for identification. Let's return to our common terminology. Gifted rules specify parents should be provided the opportunity to provide input into the gifted identification process. You know, parents provide valuable insight into their child's strengths and abilities and interests. Now, primary points for parent involvement in the process could be a referral or adding other important information to the body of evidence, such as a rating scale or other student-related data. So one note about parental input. If a parent is asked to complete that parent form that comes with the scales for identifying gifted students because it is normed reference, and they complete that form, it may be used as qualifying evidence for identification. However, if somebody else is also asked to complete the SIGs, for example, a teacher, that scale can't be used twice as qualifying evidence. So in review, a body of evidence is made up of many assessments. Some are used to qualify a student for gifted identification, and some are simply used to develop the student learning profile. It is now time for you to pause this webinar and review the assessments that make up your district's body of evidence. You will resume the webinar after you have discussed this with your group. Go ahead and pause the webinar at this point. Welcome back. Before concluding part 1 of this webinar, we will examine just a few more terms as they pertain to gifted identification. Screening means an assessment method that uses a variety of tools to determine if resulting data will provide evidence of exceptional potential in an area of giftedness. Now, these screening tools may be qualitative or quantitative in nature, as we've discussed previously. They may be standardized or they may be normative. Screening data are one component in a body of evidence for making identification and instructional decisions. Now, our guidelines establish the need to provide multiple pathways for a gifted identification referral. This graphic represents some of those different pathways of referral for the gifted screening process. Universal screening, then, means the systemic assessment of all students within a grade level for the purpose of identifying students with exceptional ability or potential, especially students from traditionally underrepresented populations. Now, a universal screening may also occur in conjunction with the creation of a student's individual career and academic plan, otherwise known as an ICAP. This typically occurs around the middle school level. So what universal screening means is that an entire class would have equal access to a measure the AU selects, such as a cognitive abilities test. It is always preferable to give these measures to all eligible and potential members of a population. Now, only giving them to a few members that you select, often based on an initial nomination or some type of a screening phase, will lead to the under-identification of culturally diverse students. Now, although strongly recommended, universal screening is not mandated in ECEA rules. After completing a universal screener, you may determine there are some students who have a body of evidence to go ahead and move forward with formal identification. But there may be some students whose data does not show criteria for identification, but it does demonstrate high ability or potential. A district might then consider collecting additional data on these students or adding these students to what we call the talent pool. A talent pool then is defined as a group of students who demonstrate advanced performance or potential in a particular area, but at this time do not meet the criteria for gifted identification. Or the determination team decides additional differentiation and observation is needed prior to making that formal identification decision. So an AU may have a certain number of students identified as gifted who receive programming to meet their unique learning needs. Then there's this larger group of students that might make up the talent pool. If students are identified as participants of this talent pool, differentiated programming must be provided to these students. Simply flagging their names and including them for an on-watch list is not creating a talent pool. The question that districts must then answer is, which students will be selected for our talent pool? What type of programming will they receive? And for how long will they remain in our talent pool? It is the hope that by putting students into a talent pool within 1 to 3 years, the student has supporting data to make a formal gifted identification. Again, strongly recommended as best practice, the creation of a talent pool is not mandated in rule. So let's review. The identification process begins with a referral. These referrals must come from multiple sources. There must be multiple types of referrals, and referrals must occur at multiple times during a child's education career. The referral then leads to the collection of a body of evidence. The body of evidence must contain quantitative and qualitative data. Additional supporting data builds the student profile to help develop appropriate programming options. A review team then makes a decision about the student. The review team is a group of educators with at least one member trained in gifted education. The AU determines how a member is trained. Trained is not the same thing as endorsed in gifted education. Now, that review team may determine that the body of evidence supports gifted identification, or the team may decide that more data should be collected on the student, or the student is a candidate for talent pool selection. At this point, your facilitators should pause the webinar and discuss these important topics. Please review your gifted screening process. Do you conduct universal screening? If so, what instruments are you using? At what grade levels and at what time of year? How do you collect referrals? What are your multiple sources? What are the types of referrals that you have, and what years do you solicit those referrals? Do you identify a talent pool? If so, what criteria are used for identification into that talent pool? How long do students stay in the talent pool? And what type of programming do students receive? At this point, we'll ask you to pause the webinar. You will then be ready to begin part 2 of the Gifted Identification webinar, which will review the areas of identification.